Hello and welcome to week 4 of EDST 536, Internationalization of Canadian Higher Education. Some orienting questions for this week as you read the readings and listen to the lecture, as well as think about your assignments for this week are: what and whose interests are driving the push for internationalization of higher education in Canada? What are the different ways of framing internationalization? And of these, what are the most common and which are the most marginalized? What are some of the emergent tensions and paradoxes of internationalization efforts? And how will COVID-19 affect the future of internationalization? And how would different approaches to reform approach this future? So first, just a few basics of internationalization, and specifically in Canada. The most commonly cited definition of internationalization comes from Jane Knight. It was originally formulated in the 1990s and has been somewhat revised since then, but essentially stays the same. And that is that internationalization is the process of integrating international, intercultural, or global dimension into the purpose, functions, or delivery of post-secondary education. So this is pretty general. It includes a wide range of things that could go under the heading of internationalization, and it doesn't have a particularly politicized or critical dimension to it. It's simply trying to describe and include anything that could be considered international. Then we also have this quote from Ashish Nandi, and it's not specifically about internationalization, but about education more generally. But I think it can act as a nice pair for the Knight definition, because Nandi really emphasizes that internationalization, in this case, could be a form of pluralizing the future by pluralizing knowledge in the present in order to produce a better, more honest, and wider range of options, material, ideational, and normative, for human beings and societies to choose from. So it's likely that the Knight definition would be more aligned with minor reform approaches, although it could be used elsewhere. And the Nandi gestures more towards a major reform or even a beyond reform approach, but we'll talk about that in just a few minutes. First, I just want to go over some statistics for the context of Canada. One that is striking comes from various sources, but one of these that has put out a number of reports that could be useful and does one every year about the status of internationalization in Canada comes from the Canadian Bureau of International Education, or CBIE. So if you're looking for more detail, I'll share a few statistics, but if you're looking for more of a breakdown, that's a great place to look. But one thing that's striking here is that if we compare the 2018 numbers, where over 435,000 international students were studying in Canada, compared to less than 20 years earlier in 2000, where there were 35,000 students, that's a huge increase. One thing I will note as well is that this includes not just higher education students, but also students in K through 12. However, nonetheless, these numbers are striking, and we're going to talk a bit about why this rise came so dramatically. I also just included a bit more information about where international students are coming from. So the vast majority, as of 2018 data from 2017, is that most of the students in universities are coming from China, and a not very close second is from India. And then the numbers are a bit switched when it comes to students in college programs, where the vast majority are coming from India. And then we have the 3rd, 4th, and 5th places here as well. One thing I'll also note is that a lot of emphasis when we talk about internationalization ends up being on international student mobility, despite the fact that internationalization also includes many other kinds of activities and initiatives. The reasons for that we will also discuss, but that's partly why I focus so much on this topic in the lecture, and why you'll see it as such an emphasis on the materials that you might be reviewing. So as always, there's not just one way to approach internationalization or reforms related to internationalization. One framework we can consider draws on the basic no reform, minor reform, major reform, and beyond reform approaches to internationalization. This actually comes from an article that I wrote with some colleagues that tries to map the different approaches to internationalization. And I'll just review these briefly here. Of course, I will, as always, upload the slides for you to review in more detail, or you can check out that publication. So the first approach to internationalization that we mapped, and this actually came out of a research project that was conducted in over 20 countries, funded by the Finnish government to understand the ethical questions that surround internationalization. And what we found was that probably the most common in terms of institutional policies was internationalization for a global knowledge economy. And this, we would say, really doesn't look for a reform or a change. It's seeking to continue business as usual. Now, the main goal of this approach to internationalization is really improving both individual and national level economic advantages. At the institutional level, there's generally a concern for income generation, and this also has to do with the fact that as internationalization has grown, it's been concurrent with the privatization of higher education. So for instance, in a country like Canada that has in the past, say, 30 years, seen a steady decrease in public funding for higher education, institutions are looking for ways to supplement their income. If it's not going to come from public monies, then where is it going to come from? And one strategy that they have used is to have that additional income that's been lost to come from international students whom they generally charge much higher fees. So this is probably the most common, most dominant driver of internationalization in our institutions. And it's also very common at the national level, as we'll see in a moment. Somewhat common as well, especially among faculty and staff as well, is this idea of internationalization for a global public good. And we could say that this would entail a sort of minor reform approach to internationalization. So the emphasis here is really on serving the global public good, so democratizing access to institutions like UBC, expanding opportunity for social mobility, and making our institutions generally more fair and inclusive. There's, for instance, a desire to balance international and local students, to advance democratic ideals, and to, in many cases, serve other parts of the world that may have less higher education opportunities. So I think if we consider that this approach and the no reform or global knowledge economy approach are the most dominant, it's really important to put them in conversation. So one very quick way of framing these is that the first one, internationalization for a global knowledge economy, is a trade-based approach to internationalization. So it actually treats education itself as a means of trade and economic growth for the host country. Whereas internationalization for the global public good is generally framed as an aid-based approach to internationalization. And by that, it is framed as countries like Canada, who have more economic influence and political power, are generally framing higher education as something to be shared with the rest of the world. So it's generally viewed as something benevolent, that Canada wants to share its education with the rest of the world. And this was a very common approach in the post-World War II or the Cold War era. This was the dominant logic that shaped internationalization efforts during this time. Now, many people favorably compare this aid-based approach to internationalization to the current trade-based approach. And there's a lot to that. At the same time, if we look over to the major and beyond reform approaches, we have a critique of even internationalization for the global public good, which is that it tends to assume that Western forms of higher education are superior, and therefore it is benevolent to grant access to those institutions to other people around the world, which has underlying colonial assumptions about the superiority of Western knowledge. So the anti-oppressive approach to internationalization, or what we might call a major reform approach, is really more interested in working in partnership for systemic change towards global justice, and often informed by a critical race or anti-colonial perspective. The emphasis is acting in solidarity with those who are understood to be systemically oppressed, and viewing the institution of the university as a critic and conscious of society. So a place to address these global inequalities and approaching internationalization in that way, in ways that don't, for instance, assume the superiority of Western knowledge, but actually try to center marginalized voices. This is not particularly common in approaches to internationalization. We found in our study a few examples of this, not generally in university policy, but in smaller initiatives happening on a piecemeal basis rather than happening at an institutional level, although there sometimes were gestures toward this in more formal policies. Then we have the most probably rare approach to internationalization, which was what we called relational translocalism. And this would be the beyond reform approach. And we honestly didn't find at any institutional level examples of this approach to internationalization, but we did find smaller initiatives generally in the cracks of institutions or sometimes even outside of formal institutions that were trying to imagine internationalization very differently, that said, maybe we can use existing institutions to enact important change, but ultimately we need to also look outside of these institutions towards other knowledge communities in order to think about other possibilities for education that would not reproduce the dominant political, economic, and social systems, and not simply move to center a different kind of knowledge, but to enact an entirely different approach to knowledge, one that acknowledges what Boaventura de Sousa Santos calls an ecology of knowledges. So really acknowledging that there's no universal knowledge system, but that each knowledge system offers something and has its own limitations. Again, this is probably the rarest approach to internationalization. We found only a few examples, one of which was a study abroad program that was located in Brazil that really brought mostly U.S. students from elite universities to Brazil to work with indigenous and Black communities involved in different forms of struggle, and really challenging students to see not the general framing of themselves as coming as helpers, but actually coming as people to learn from those communities, and also understanding themselves as implicated in the struggles that those communities are fighting against. Now, this program was so controversial, in fact, that it was actually recently stopped its funding by the institution that was hosting it. So we can see that efforts to try and do something very differently generally are very difficult to sustain because they challenge so much the normative status quo. So I think it's important, again, as with the context of indigenization and decolonization, that we have all of these approaches on the table and consider where they're coming from, what they enable, and what each of them also forecloses. And at the same time, as we have them all on the table, we understand that they don't come with the same institutional power. So it's not a flat landscape where we simply decide which approach is the best, but actually one where when we come to the table, these approaches already have different forms of institutional value. And many of them are marginalized, or not even more than marginalized, they're entirely ignored. And that would be the case with the Beyond Reform approach. So with all of that in mind, in order to kind of illustrate what each of these different approaches would allow, I think we can start looking at some examples. So a no reform approach to internationalization that continues with business as usual would be the example that you read this week, which comes from the Canadian government, which is their international education strategy. So there are usually economic rationales that dominate this approach, emphasizing expected revenues, tax income, job creation. And I don't need to go into too much detail because I know you're going to read it this week. But one interesting thing to note is that this newer strategy follows on the previous one, which was the first ever national level education strategy, international education strategy. but they actually mirror each other quite closely. So, for instance, in the 2014 document, we see that the statement, perhaps most importantly, international education fuels the people-to-people ties crucial to long-term success in an increasingly interconnected global economy. So the global economy takes center stage in that document. And we also see in the most recent document, again, by building on the sector's success, the strategy will equip Canada with the skills, knowledge, and expertise needed to innovate and thrive in the global economy. So in both cases, we see the global economy being centered, and despite all of the efforts of many more critical scholars of internationalization, we don't see much of a shift from 2014 to 2018. Now, more sort of examples of this economic no reform focus of internationalization comes from the Immigration, Refugees, and Citizenship Canada. And we see that there's a very blunt statement about why international students matter to Canada. And the first thing listed is that they contribute $15.5 billion annually to the economy. The second is also related to revenue and growth for the education sector. The third element is that they enrich the academic experience of domestic students and contribute to internationalization of Canadian institutions. So this is not as economically focused, but we can notice again that all of the advantages are framed as benefiting Canadian students and Canadian institutions. The benefit for international students and their communities, or for what we might imagine as a global public good, is not addressed here. And then the last two are also economically focused. So we can see that there is an extremely strong emphasis at the level of especially national government to focus on the economic implications of internationalization. I actually had last year, as part of their final project for this course, a student create a kind of parody of this no reform internationalization for the knowledge economy approach. And he made, in one case, these, they're actually coupons. So it says that you have discounted international fees, but then there's a small print, which is that relative to the United States, international student fees, and that fees are subject to change anytime the provincial government decides to cut funding. So this was kind of an effort to draw attention to the potentially harmful implications of this economic focus with a bit of satire and humor. So please check this out in more detail. Then we have, again, this minor reform approach, so internationalization for the global public good. The emphasis here is on, again, transferring knowledge and skills to international students and their communities. There's often a kind of nostalgia for the post-war era of internationalization that was perceived to be more benevolent. There's a focus on cultural competency trainings and really an emphasis on embracing international students' contributions to the institution. So you'll see an example here which comes from following the travel ban of the United States, which affected some international students. There was an effort on the part of many U.S. universities to create a campaign that would emphasize that international students are welcome on their campus. So we have these "You Are Welcome Here" campaigns. There's an example here from Temple University, but there's also many other institutions that had something similar. So as noted before, the major reform approach to internationalization is really focused on questions of justice and inequality. An example from this comes from an effort, I believe, 1 or 2 years ago to actually paint the engineering block on the UBC campus, where it was written 6 times difference domestic versus international student, referring to the tuition difference between international and domestic students, and also UBC rips international students. I assume that is meant to say UBC rips off international students. So we can see that there is a resistance to things like tuition differences and especially tuition raises, again, efforts to diversify international student body and related topics. So one thing to draw attention to is that one of the things you're reading for this week is the Associations of Canadian Deans of Education Accord on Internationalization. And within this accord, I think there are actually multiple different perspectives. I know a bit about the history of how it was created, and it brought together people who come from slightly different perspectives in their approach to internationalization. So I think you can actually find strands of minor and major reform in here. But they emphasize three areas of concern at this intersection between minor and major reform. And that has to do with the ways that, first, international mobility has strained the capacity of institutions to respond in ways that are socially accountable. And I think that is meant to indicate ways that are socially accountable to both domestic and international communities. The second being that we really need to rethink our curriculum, especially if we're going to have more diverse student bodies, not only international students, but also domestic students as well. Then we really need to rethink the tendency towards Eurocentric curricula. And then third is that the economic imperatives have really driven the growth of internationalization, and there is not much consideration paid to how this affects the vulnerability of marginalized communities. Again, I think both domestic and international students. So these are the three areas of concern pointed out in this accord. And I think as you read the internationalization strategy of different institutions, you'll find that it may or may not include elements from major, minor, or no reform perspectives. I would be surprised if there was a beyond reform, but that would be an interesting finding. So the beyond reform, I don't actually have a specific example. I mentioned one when reviewing them earlier, that study abroad, service abroad in Brazil example. But beyond reform, again, these approaches tend to be in the cracks of institutions, so they're not necessarily well advertised or easy to find. Sometimes they're even intentionally hidden because they don't want to draw too much attention to themselves, because this could draw unwanted scrutiny from those people who are interested in more of the dominant no reform and minor reform perspectives. But generally speaking, this approach to internationalization is not really interested in offering solutions of how to do internationalization better per se, but really invites people to interrupt their satisfaction with what are perceived to be colonial desires, to sit with their unevenly distributed complicity in harm on a global scale, and also to reduce harm. So as we think about what these beyond reform approaches might look like, or what the major reform approaches might look like too, how can we do that in ways that don't produce further harm for communities that are already marginalized by these processes? One thing that's important to note as well is the ways that these discourses circulate. And I think particularly we have seen in the past 5 to 10 years an increased interest in the more critical approaches to internationalization, including major reform, less so the beyond reform. And you can actually see an example of this in the UBC international strategy, the most recent one, where there is an acknowledgement of UBC's complicity in colonialism in historical and contemporary ways. Now, what you notice as well, however, is that there's not much follow-up in terms of what the university intends to do in relation to these colonial relations. So much like the process of decolonization and indigenization, there's generally this dance where the critique becomes adopted by the institution up to a point in order to kind of satisfy those who are offering the critique to an extent, but it doesn't necessarily result in substantive institutional change. So I think it's interesting to watch those dynamics, and as you're reading the internationalization policies, if you do find these more critical approaches, to ask, are they accompanied by substantive institutional commitments to actually transform the ways that the institution does business, or is it more of a tokenistic inclusion? So I also want to just talk and sort of end on this question of emergent tensions and paradoxes of internationalization. And I actually think this issue of the increasing adoption of more critical approaches in not necessarily critical ways is one of these emergent tensions. But I think partly we can think about these tensions in relation to many different layers of responsibilities and relationships that we have as we work, study, and teach at higher education institutions. So one thing that I really always try to emphasize in my courses, including this one, is that in our practice, whether we are staff, faculty, or students, we're going to encounter complex challenges. These challenges usually don't have simple or fast solutions, but unfortunately we are often encouraged to put forward simple and fast solutions. And sometimes we have no choice but to respond in that way. But in a course like this, you are strongly encouraged to sit with that complexity, to sit with the difficulty of responding in a way that doesn't produce further harm. So I invite you to sit with these tensions and complexities and not feel like you have to immediately resolve them. And you might find that actually sitting with these tensions can enable you to, in the long term, respond to those challenges in a different way. So that's my invitation in general, and especially in relation to this topic. And one way of sitting with those complexities is to see that there's actually many nested layers of responsibility and relationship. So in relation to internationalization, I've included a few of these here. So one is the individual and interpersonal layer. These are our academic and pastoral responsibilities to students in front of us, especially given their structural vulnerabilities in the institution. So how do we actually respond to students, international students, who bring us the issues that they're facing? Then there is the institutional layer of responsibility and relationship. We have certain expectations coming from our employers if we work for the university, or from governmental offices that have their own agendas that as the employee we're expected to align with, at least to a great extent. Then we also have to encounter students' own investments, and these vary. They are multiple and contradictory, and I'll say more about that in a minute, but we aren't encountering a hegemonic international student body. We are encountering not only unique individuals, but individuals who have particular social, political, national backgrounds that don't necessarily align with each other. So how are we responding to those different investments that they come to the university with? Then there's also the social, political, and economic context, which is beyond the institution itself. And that has to do with things like the privatization of higher education that makes internationalization an economic imperative for many institutions, the growth of the global middle class, which tends to be a source of international students for many universities. But then we also see that with this growth of the middle class, there's also a declining number of, quote, good jobs in the world. So we are preparing students to compete within this extremely competitive global labor market when they graduate from our institutions. And what is our role in preparing them for that? And then we also see things like resurgent nationalisms in many countries across the world. So the US, Brazil, Hungary, all of these have fairly right-wing governments that have implemented certain policies and general environments that are not necessarily welcoming to international students. How does that affect internationalization of higher education? And then, of course, we have the historical context. And, of course, we can reference back to our unit on foundations of higher education. But in short, we have ongoing legacies of settler colonialism in a place like Canada, ongoing legacies of Canadian imperialism abroad as well, and this general context of Western geopolitical, economic, and epistemological hegemony that our institutions are generally a part of, and that we are navigating even on this micro scale of interacting with international students. So this is just a minor look into some of the many complexities that are involved in questions of how we respond ethically and responsibly to the challenges of internationalization. And I'll just close with the example of how these complexities impact international student research on international students, which, as I noted at the beginning, is really probably the primary concern in terms of internationalization, for better or for worse, because there are many elements of internationalization that get ignored when we exclusively focus on this topic, yet it is also an extremely important one. So I want to draw our attention to some of these complexities in that area. So the first is, of course, that international students are facing a range of stressors, and these are things like culture shock, discrimination, adjusting to different contexts, different values and customs. They often face financial hardships. They don't always have appropriate accommodation. They might feel isolated or lonely. And this is just some of the many challenges that our students are facing when they come to our universities. Now, there is that side of things, but what we often find is that, unfortunately, when it comes to the way students are framed, both in our institutions and in many cases in the internationalization research, it's fairly one-dimensional. So all of those layers that I mentioned before aren't necessarily attended to, or perhaps one is, but we have a really difficult time holding all of the layers at once. So we find, for instance, this tendency to frame international students as either forms of cash, so institutional economic imperatives, sources of competition, so the perception that international students are taking spots away from domestic students, or as a form of charity. So this goes back to that aid model of internationalization, that international students are objects of Western benevolence, and they are receiving Western knowledge through the generosity of the institution. These are the common ways, and all of these are problematic. But generally speaking, we can only conceptualize international students in one of these dimensions. Similarly, we find them sometimes framed as villains, again, if they're perceived as competition, or as victims of the institution or the national economic imperative, or sometimes as victors, so people who are courageously fighting against institutional injustice. And these are very, again, one-sided, unidimensional depictions of international students, and they don't necessarily help us to actually understand all of the dynamics at play, or to really respond in ways that attend to the many complexities involved. So most research about international students is how-to research. It's focused on questions of how do we increase enrollments or sustain enrollments, and this is even in the case of some critical research. So for instance, we have some critical research about racism against international students being framed as a problem largely because of the fear that this will result in declining international student enrollments. So the primary concern isn't framed as that this is detrimental to the students. It's sort of tacitly acknowledged that that's the case, but the primary focus of why people should care about this issue is actually sometimes on the impact it might have on enrollment numbers. Then we have questions of ensuring student success and adaptability, which is important, but doesn't necessarily get at deeper questions of what kind of environment are we asking them to adapt to? Are we also adapting ourselves and our courses, or are we only expecting it to be one-sided? So there's actually quite little research on areas that might be quite important, and that I've actually seen many conversations about in terms of when these issues actually come up, but for some reason there's a real hesitancy to tackle them in the research, and I think partly it's because it challenges these one-sided depictions that have easy narratives, but that don't necessarily get at the difficulties. So we see little research about how international issues relate to questions of equity for domestic racialized students or Indigenous students. So in many cases, for instance, there's a perception that there's only a limited amount of resources provided by the institution for marginalized populations, and that they're expected to actually compete amongst themselves for those resources because the majority of resources are actually reserved for dominant white Canadian students. So how is that dynamic actually playing out? And how can we not assume that international students and domestic racialized students and indigenous students actually have the same challenges, or that they necessarily get along? Then there's also very little research about the experiences of international students outside the West. I just read a very interesting piece that was drawing attention to the experiences of African students studying in China. And the article is essentially arguing that when we only focus on the experiences of international students studying in the West and their challenges, we don't always think about how international students elsewhere are also facing challenges and forms of marginalization. And then finally, there's really a lack of research that addresses the complexities of international students' lived experiences. If we want to think about some of those complexities, then we need to think about international students, as all students, as complex people who come with both their own social, historical, national context, which is beyond the individual, which is a collective level, but also their own individual investments and interests. So I just want to offer one example of where we can see the tensions and complexities of internationalization, particularly as it relates to international students, that we can't attend to if we are using simplistic, one-sided narratives or looking for easy answers to the challenges we face. So this example comes from a book called Paradise Redefined by Vanessa Fong, and it's talking about the experience of Chinese students studying abroad. And I'll let you read the text. I will upload the slides as always. But essentially what's happening here is that the students have gone to study in Ireland and find out that actually it's not as great as they thought it might be. There's actually a student who says probably 90% of Chinese students abroad think life isn't as good as they thought it would be, and she's drawing on her own example. And she's talking to her friend who said, I don't know why you didn't tell me that was your experience when you were studying abroad, because you made it sound like it was great, and if you had told me like how it really was, I probably wouldn't have come. And the first student says, I couldn't say that because I would lose face. I spent so much money on studying abroad. I didn't want to say that I didn't like it. That would sound really bad. So I think this really gets at the complexities involved in international study, and that our students are encountering, but we're not necessarily equipping them to make sense of. And this is a phenomenon, this specific phenomenon actually, that I've heard from other students as well. I had a postdoctoral student studying with me who was doing research about Brazilian students studying in Canada. And when she interviewed the students, what they said when they were here was that, well, actually, I found that a lot of my instructors in Brazil were better than the instructors I found in Canada, and that there were a lot of things that did not live up to my expectations when I arrived here. But when she interviewed them again later, after they'd gone back to Brazil, they didn't mention any of these challenges. They actually had really positive narratives about their experience in Canada. And she asked them about this discrepancy. And they said, yeah, I still agree with what I said when you first interviewed me, but I can't say that now that I'm back in Brazil, because if I do that, then others will devalue my experience, and I won't gain the cultural or economic capital that I would have gained if I paint the experience as a positive one. So we see many layers at work here, and we kind of understand our challenge of trying to respond in ways that attend to these complexities, that support students that are going through this, and then think about the wider dynamics involved. I think one way of concluding this discussion is to draw on the insights from Lisa Brunner, who's a PhD student actually in EDST, and also who works in the International Student Office. And she's drawing here on her research as well as her own experience as a staff person. She says, unexpected questions can arise as students navigate mixed messages circulated across campuses, cities, and the media. Am I a boon to the research sector or undue competition? Contributing to multiculturalism or threatening nationalism? welcomed for who I am or just my tuition? And she says that this is really an uncomfortable and confusing space for many students, and it's challenging for them. And she says that we could actually, instead of running away from this kind of complexity and difficulty, to actually use this as an educational opportunity to, for instance, encourage students to think about how they are perhaps both subject to marginalization, but also potentially complicit in others' marginalization, to think about histories of colonialism and how that impacts their experience studying in Canada. So in other words, she says, we need to support students in coming to terms with one's place in an entangled and unjust world. And then, if they're ready, guide them to dive deeper, embracing the complexities, and keep asking questions. There's no easy answers. And I think that really sums up the topic of internationalization. I'll just close with an invitation to think about the futures of internationalization. I think we can think about the impacts of climate change, of these right-wing nationalist governments that are coming to power, of impending economic crises, of global pandemics, and shifting geopolitical economic power. So for instance, while for a long time, Western nations had always been the top receiving countries of international students, China is now the third highest receiving country. So after the US and the UK comes China in terms of receiving the most international students globally. So how is that going to shift the landscape of internationalization? And we can think more specifically about how COVID will affect internationalization, since we're living that right now. And as we're responding to COVID, think about how the different approaches to reform would approach the internationalization and its impacts differently. So that's all for this week. I know I tried to cover a lot. I look forward to our discussions as well as your papers addressing this topic. Thanks so much.